It's really good to be with you like this. Ian said it was an evening with Andrew Graystone. It's kind of an evening without Andrew Graystone, isn't it? Under other circumstances, I would be travelling at the moment to launch a book that I've written that comes out next week. The book is called Faith, Hope and Mischief. And it's a book of stories. And I hope that you'll be interested in it. I'm going to tell some of the stories this evening. I'm going to tell you 4 or 5 short stories this evening from the book. So they're all very different. Some of them last just a couple of minutes. Others are a bit longer. All of these stories are true, and they all come from my own experience, although some of them happened as much as 35 years ago, and another one happened a few weeks back. In fact, I'm going to tell them in reverse order, the most recent ones first. So these are all stories that are in the book, Faith, Hope and Mischief. And if you would like to hear more like this, you can go to an online bookshop like Waterstones or Amazon, and you can order it there. The thing that holds these together, I guess, is that these stories are about 5 moments in my life when pretty much by accident, I found myself in the wrong place at the right time. In a way, that's what links all these stories together. And I've come to believe that standing in places that I don't belong is actually a sort of a vocation. It's what I do. So the first story I'm going to tell you is the most recent, and it's called You Are My Friends. I usually wake up to the Today programme on BBC Radio 4. On the morning of the 15th of March 2019, I woke up to the news of terrible events in Christchurch, New Zealand. A young man had walked into 2 mosques during Friday prayers. He was carrying 5 guns. He carefully decorated each one using Tipp-Ex with symbols and slogans representing white supremacy. He shot 51 people dead that day and wounded 29 others. Then he got in his car and he set off for a 3rd mosque, but he was arrested before he got there. Now, Christchurch is known as a fairly tranquil city in a relatively peaceful country. It's about 12,000 miles from Manchester, where I live. I've never been there, and I don't suppose I ever will. But my first thought when I heard the news bulletin was that if this could happen in Christchurch, it could happen anywhere. I wondered how the people who gathered for prayers at my local mosque in Levenshulme might feel this morning. Angry? Mistrustful? Afraid? I couldn't stop thinking about them all morning. At about 11:30, people would be leaving work and heading towards the mosque for Friday prayers. I thought I would walk there too. I wasn't really sure why. I just felt I wanted to be with them. But as I was leaving the house, I wondered what on earth I would do when I got there. I just felt that I might look a bit silly standing there in the road and grinning. So I grabbed a piece of cardboard, an old file hanger actually, and I wrote a message on it saying, "You are my friends, I will watch while you pray." And then I read it back to myself, and the idea of watching while someone else prayed sounded a little bit creepy. So I stuck a piece of paper over it and tried again, and I wrote, "You are my friends, I will keep watch while you pray." That was a bit better. And then I set off towards the mosque. When I got to the mosque, people were just beginning to arrive. I stood outside with my sign. It's a big mosque with several hundred worshippers. And I was struck by how much of a rush people were in as they arrived, just like my own church, I thought, with people hurrying in during the first hymn. Some looked a bit wary when they saw me standing by the entrance. Perhaps they thought I was some kind of protester or an evangelist hoping to convert them. But when they saw the card, some of them smiled, but most of them just walked straight on by. I stayed at the gate for about an hour and a half until people started to leave. When everyone came out, the atmosphere was different. Everyone wanted to shake my hand, thank me, and salam me. Someone took a picture of me with my cardboard sign. It turned out that the imam at the mosque had seen me as he walked into the service and mentioned me in his sermon. For a day that had started with such bleak news, it was turning into quite a happy atmosphere. A man outside the mosque was cooking chicken biryani and he gave me a foil box full of it, so that felt like a win. And then I toddled off home to get on with my day. The man who took the photo uploaded it to our community website with a message saying, "Who is this guy?" As the day went on, I discovered that the picture was being shared quite widely on the internet, and not just on our local Facebook page. Not only in the UK either, but around the world. I started to get messages by email and Twitter from strangers. At first, I replied to each message as it came in. Then they started coming faster and faster. By the end of the afternoon, they were coming so fast I couldn't even keep up with reading them. Besides the personal messages, there were likes and retweets and Facebook posts, literally millions of them, all sharing the picture, the one on that you may have seen with me holding that sign. By tea time, I was starting to realise that I'd gone, if not viral, then at least fungal. I didn't post anything on social media myself, though my daughter posted a nice message saying she was proud of me. But in the next few hours, my picture was retweeted with warm messages from the weirdest range of people, from Will Smith's wife, Jada Pinkett Smith, and Monica Lewinsky, and scores of others. And the snowball kept on rolling down the hill, faster and faster. Within a few hours, I was getting messages from journalists and radio and TV stations in every country you can imagine, from Turkey and Egypt and Bangladesh. Who was I? Why had I done this? Would I be prepared to give them an interview? I had to decide quite quickly how I was going to respond. I thought the best thing to do was to roll with it. So I made a decision that I would say yes to everyone except Piers Morgan, and that's what I did. On Saturday, I did live interviews back to back by phone, by Skype, in TV studios. When Saturday evening came, I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was all over. But then Australia and New Zealand woke up and started getting in touch. The attacks were in New Zealand, and the attacker had come from Australia. And perhaps the greatest privilege of all was to be able to speak to the people of Christchurch via their local TV and radio stations. I was able to say that we in Manchester know something about what they're feeling because we've had our own atrocities, but that we also know that friendship can overcome fear. On the Monday, I had a message of thanks from the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the wonderful Jacinda Ardern. The Secretary General of the United Nations mentioned me in a speech about reconciliation, and so did a minister from the UK Foreign Office. Over the next few days, I received in excess of 50,000 individual messages. They came from almost every country in the world, from Hollywood to Hyderabad, and the photo was copied tens of millions of times. In 24 hours, my Twitter followers went up from their normal 3,000 to over 15,000. Usually I regret about 1 in 3 of my tweets, but I realised that I would need to start being a bit more careful about what I said. I became the subject of sermons and school assemblies and radio phone-ins. The response was overwhelmingly positive, although of course there were a few unpleasant ones. I was apparently raised in the Scottish Parliament as an example of the need for social media platforms to censor abusive messages, though to this day I haven't been able to find the abusive messages that they were referring to. 1 or 2 people asked what exactly I was planning to do if a gunman had approached the mosque. To be honest, I hadn't really thought about that. Armed with a file hanger and a flat cap, I made a pretty inadequate vigilante. But the point was to be there, and everybody visiting the mosque seemed to understand that. Amongst the negative messages, one common complaint was, "Are you going to stand guard outside every mosque in the world then?" To which my answer was, "No, I'll stand outside my local mosque, and you can stand outside yours." Indeed, people from other cities around the world started to do just that. I was sent pictures of people standing outside mosques in their own cities, some of them with signs saying, "You are my friends. I will keep watch while you pray." One lovely couple in Reading had even written their sign on an old file hanger, as if that was a key part of the plot. Another common message in the negative pile was, well, you wouldn't find Muslims protecting churches if it was the other way round. But in fact, the following month, when a church in Sri Lanka was attacked by a Muslim gunman, groups from mosques all around the world did just that, standing outside their local churches in solidarity. Now, my family will confirm that I was bemused by the whole experience. The whole thing was unplanned, unexpected, and completely disproportionate. The simple message I had tried to pass on is that friendship can overcome fear. Hatred doesn't generate itself. Hatred is a byproduct of fear, fear of someone who is just slightly different from me. Some of the stuff that happened was a bit bizarre. A woman from Essex knitted a puppet of me holding the sign. An artist in Dorset painted me in oils. A man in New Zealand drew a cartoon picture of me on the side of a paper cup and then sent it to me. I got some lovely offers too. The picture was particularly big in Turkey, apparently, and a generous guy there offered to ship me over so that he could buy me a drink. A Muslim dentist in the Midlands wrote to say that in gratitude for my actions, he would like to offer to whiten my teeth for free, which is a pretty backhanded compliment, really. I'm still reflecting on what has happened and is continuing to happen. I wasn't expecting to be interviewed on Voice of Islam radio or bad-mouthed by far-right groups or discussed on Loose Women. I'm aware that all the nice things that were said to me and about me, and all the not so nice things as well, were not actually being addressed to me personally, but to the action and what it symbolised. One of the themes to emerge from the tens of thousands of messages I received is that Muslims in the UK and elsewhere live with a mild but perpetual undercurrent of threat. It's like a buzzing in the ears, varying in intensity according to context, but requiring from them constant vigilance. Of course, other people live with similar kinds of anxiety. Perhaps we all do, though as a white middle-class man in the UK, my threat level is almost inaudible. For others, it's like the relentless hum of tinnitus. Unwittingly, my tiny action and the message on my card seem to have suggested to people that I understood the impact of this level of persistent fear. The word Islamophobia suggests a fear of Muslims, but the effect is to generate a fear in Muslims. And both sides of that unholy equation need to be dealt with. I'm learning a lot about the extraordinary power of symbols in everyday activism. The thing that went viral was not me, but an image of a smiling bloke in a flat hat carrying a scrappy piece of cardboard with a message on it. It's not even clear from the picture that I was standing in front of a mosque because the building's being redeveloped and it's surrounded by blue hoardings. That image is associated with an action. The particular action was as simple as standing outside a mosque on a pavement for 90 minutes. But it proved to have a symbolic power vastly beyond anything that I intended or could ever have planned. All I was doing was standing in a place where I don't immediately belong, outside the gate of a mosque complex. The fact of doing so was simple to the point of being trivial, but the meanings that attached to the symbol seemed to have quite a powerful resonance. If I tried to manufacture it, it would have failed. What people seemed to respond to was an image of an ordinary looking bloke wearing a flat cap and a jumper doing something a bit transgressive. I jumped over the fence and gone into my neighbour's territory. That was exactly what the Christchurch gunman had done, except that where he went with guns and hatred, I went open-handed and smiling. Some people thanked me for taking a risk. Well, What risk? A small risk of rejection, perhaps, the possibility of being misunderstood. But you can't start a friendship of any kind without taking small risks. If I had any idea when I woke up that morning that my picture was going to be shared around the world, I would at least have brushed my hair. It's nice when someone sends you a message saying, "You are a symbol of the world I want to live in." It's nice when someone shouts "hero" at you in the street, or stops you in Asda and asks for a selfie. Nice, but also weird nice. I'm just trying to roll with it. Tomorrow, it will all be forgotten. Probably. Thank you. That's the end of my first story. Thank you. Oh, that's really kind of you. Thank you so much. I'm going to take you back a little bit. We're going backwards in time through various bits of my life. And I'm going back to the 1990s for the next story. If you feel you need to, this is where if I were a primary teacher, I would say, feel free to get up and have a stretch and turn around, or go make yourself something to drink. That'll be absolutely fine. This next story is called The Battle of Adswood Library. Throughout the 1990s and beyond, I lived with my family on a downtown housing estate called Adswood in South Manchester. Adswood wasn't one of those huge estates that get a lot of attention. To be honest, it hadn't got much going for it at all. It was just an island of deprivation in the sea of mediocrity that is Stockport. But the friends and neighbours I met in Adswood were beautiful people, and they've left a mark on me more than anyone I've ever met. I stood out like a sore thumb in Adswood. I was working at the BBC at the time, and every day I'd go out in the morning and come back onto the estate at night, carrying my massively untrendy briefcase. I learnt that some of the children assumed I was a doctor. It was a fair assumption, since no professional people actually lived on the estate. No teachers, no social workers, not even the vicar, who had a large detached house a couple of miles away. Adswood was a rough and ready place to live. We saw many people move onto the estate and then move straight off again. When we first moved there, one of the local councillors said to us, "The trouble with Adswood is, it doesn't have a voice." The one thing Adswood did have was a library. I say library, it was just a single room with bookshelves and a friendly librarian. Older people from the estate would meet there for coffee during the day, and kids who lived in overcrowded houses went there after school to do their homework with help from the friendly librarian. Then the local council decided that Adswood Library needed to close. Nothing spiteful, just the usual cost-cutting exercise in the town hall. After all, who needs a library in a place where people don't even have books in their own homes? When the news filtered through, most of the Adswood residents just accepted it as inevitable. One of the strategies many Adswood people used to get through life was simply not to entertain hope. If you don't hope for things to be better, you don't get hurt when they turn out worse. The politicians knew this, and it made Adswood an easy target. Still, for a few people, the loss of Adswood Library was too much to take. They wanted to fight for it. Soon, a little protest group formed. "We've got to keep the library open. What can we do to make the council change its mind?" Some people wanted to chain themselves to the railings or lie down in front of the bulldozers. But we were afraid people would just say, "Well, what can you expect from Adswood people?" We knew from the start that the battle for Adswood Library was a battle we were most likely to lose. So we decided that whatever we did needed to be fun. We chose our weapons carefully: laughter, mockery, and mischief. First of all, we had to get noticed. So we invited children's authors to visit Adswood Library to give book readings. Amazingly, some really high-profile people came, and the local paper, which had only come to Adswood for stories about drugs and crime before, was delighted to print pictures of happy children in a packed library. Still, we needed to up our game. We needed to get Adswood Library onto the front page. So we wrote to the authors of the most borrowed books and told them what was about to happen to the library. Without exception, they wrote supportive letters back. Jilly Cooper and Spike Milligan, Geoffrey Archer and Alan Bennett, they all signed up for the battle for Adswood Library. Roger McGough even wrote a poem, The Ballad of Adswood Library. Their letters took us to a new level of publicity. But the more we embarrassed them, the more the council dug their heels in. The leader of the council went on national radio and gave a massively patronising interview. "These people in Adswood have no understanding of money," he said. "They just don't know how difficult it is for councillors to juggle the books." So the next week, we hired a juggler. We invited all the local councillors to come to Adswood Library for a lesson. They didn't come, of course, but the next week, the front page of the Stockport Express was a full-page picture of Adswood Library with a man in a clown costume teaching a group of children how to juggle books. The councillors were not impressed. The council leader came to my house at night to persuade us to back off. Stockport Council's struggle to close the library was being noticed elsewhere, she said. They were becoming a laughingstock. She even offered my wife a seat on the council if we would give up the battle for Adswood Library. We didn't. Membership of the library was growing. It was now the busiest library in Stockport. Pretty much everyone on the estate had a ticket. And that gave us an idea. One cold morning in October, when the librarian arrived to open the library, she found a huge queue outside. The whole estate had descended on the little library with their tickets. Now, in our area, you could borrow up to 10 books on one ticket. If you're a single parent with 3 children, that's 40 books, which is virtually a shelf full. And there were scores of us. Mums were coming in with buggies and going away loaded up with books. The local vicar turned up to lend support and went away with 10 Jackie Collins novels. I picked out 10 Judith Krantz, mainly because they were good and thick, almost 2 feet of solid books on one ticket. As battles go, this was fun. There was a party atmosphere. The librarian was delighted to be so busy. The council couldn't really object because, after all, we were only doing exactly what you're supposed to do with a library, borrowing the books. Only we borrowed them all at once. Every single one of them. By the end of the morning, the library shelves were empty. It was a celebration of books, of community, of the fact that we were just plain right to want to keep our library open. We made sure the TV cameras were there to record it, of course, and the next day we were on the front page of most of the national newspapers as the community that borrowed its library. The councillors were furious. They set a date for the library to close. It looked as if we had lost the battle for Adswood Library. The night before the day that the library was due to close, we broke the law for the first and only time. After dark, we broke into the building. To be honest, breaking and entering was a local skill that we'd probably underused in the campaign so far. We went into the inner door that led to the library and squirted a tube of superglue into the lock. Then we changed the screws on the handle for clutch screws so that it couldn't be removed. In the morning, when the librarian arrived at 8:30 to open the library for the last time, she couldn't get in. She called her bosses, who called a locksmith, who came and opened the library. The council sent 2 big security guards to the building to make sure it stayed open. When the press and the TV cameras arrived, we were able to point out that the council that thought it was so important to keep the library open today was going to close it for good tomorrow. Still, the battle for Adswood Library was lost, but we had won some significant victories. Now, when the councillors said, the trouble with Adswood is it doesn't have a voice, we were able to say, the trouble with Adswood is no one's listening. There is a postscript to this story. Just a few yards from the library, there was a roundabout with a road junction where young children used to cross the road to get to school. Cars would come round the corner at speed, and there had been several nasty accidents or near misses. Residents persuaded the council that they should install a pelican crossing, a pedestrian crossing controlled by traffic lights. They duly installed the traffic lights and painted the lines on the road, but due to a dispute between the council and the electricity board, they never actually switched on the traffic lights to control the crossing. Consequently, the crossing was more rather than less dangerous than it had been before. One morning, just after school drop-off time, parents and babies from the estate gathered at the crossing with their buggies and trolleys. At a given signal, we all walked into the road and stopped halfway, making the road completely impassable. Traffic started backing up in both directions with angry drivers hooting their horns. After a few minutes, the queue was the best part of a mile long. Then the police arrived. We explained why we were protesting. They were very polite and sympathetic, but said if we didn't leave the crossing, they would have to start making arrests. We agreed to go, but we had another plan up our sleeves. We had asked each child to bring a favourite soft toy to the protest with them. As we walked off the road, each child left a teddy or a cuddly toy behind, a furry roadblock, a picket line of cuddly animals where the crossing should have been. We stood at the side of the road, but the traffic wouldn't move. No one wanted to be the first to drive over the teddies. We took photos, of course, and sent them to the press. They loved it. The council hated it. I wish I could tell you that no cuddly toys were harmed in the protest, but I can't. In truth, they all survived unscathed except one, a multicoloured dinosaur called Daisy. Sadly, she was caught under the wheels of the 192 bus and lost an eye. Still, she bore her injury with pride and was forever after lauded in the community as a local hero. But the mighty councillors of Stockport had learned their lesson. They didn't want another Adswood Library on their hands. The next morning, the traffic lights were connected and the crossing was safe. Adswood had found a voice. Well, thank you. That's very, very kind of you. That's lovely. I have so many happy memories of being at Emmanuel, and it's lovely that from time to time the technology that you use allows me to pop in again these days. I hope you won't stop doing that when we can all meet again. I'm going to tell you another story now, if that's okay. This one takes me back a little bit further in time, and this is from the time when I my first ever job after leaving university. This is called Crossing the Road. When I was in my mid-20s, I was a youth worker in County Durham. The miners' strike was drawing to a bitter close, and I was trying to work out how the gospel I'd learnt on Saturday nights at my university Christian Union could make any sense to teenagers in an ex-pit village outside Chester Street, whose chances of getting a job, let alone going to university, were about the same as my chances of becoming a miner. Out of the blue, I was invited to a conference in London. It was called the Senior Evangelical Anglican Leaders Conference. No one loves a meaningless acronym like Senior Evangelical Anglican Leaders. I honestly don't know why I was invited, since I was none of those four things. but I was still trying to work out who I was, and I was flattered to be asked, so I went along. The conference was held at Westminster Chapel in London. It's an austere Victorian building with a wide frontage that opens directly onto a narrow London street with a slim pavement, just a couple of 100 yards from Buckingham Palace. The whole church building was packed with senior evangelical Anglican leaders, about 1,000 of them, the great and the good of evangelicalism. Someone once said to me that if you could see now every sausage that you're ever going to eat, you would never touch another one. I feel the same about senior evangelical Anglican leaders. They're fine one at a time, but 1,000 of them altogether turned out to be quite hard to stomach. It turns out that senior evangelical Anglican leaders are about 98% men, or at least they were back in those days. I felt a bit like I expect heaven will feel like if your idea of heaven is 1,000 clean-shaven white men in black shirts and British Home Stores jackets singing Graham Kendrick songs on repeat. I felt like a lion in a den of Daniels. I sat on the pew near the back on the far left. I hadn't chosen it for political or theological reasons, but with hindsight, it seems quite appropriate. The chairman was a man called the Right Reverend Michael Bourne, the Bishop of Chester. And the main attraction was Dr. George Carey, the recently appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. I remember the bishop giving his boss a long introduction that seemed more like a grandfather giving unsolicited parenting advice to his son. Now that they'd got their man into the top job, the delegates were keen to impress on him how important it was that he didn't let them down. Eventually, the Archbishop got up to speak. He'd hardly opened his mouth when there was a crash of splintering wood at the back door behind me. There was some sort of scuffle going on in the lobby. There was shouting and whistles blowing. One or more bodies crunched into the wooden doors of the church. The IRA's mainland bombing campaign was at its height just then, so most people of my age were used to being evacuated from buildings or even hearing bombs going off, but my heart raced a bit. Still, I figured that if this was my time to catch the bus to heaven, I stood a chance of stowing away with 1,000 senior evangelical Anglican leaders. If you're going to die, die next to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The next minute, the doors at the back of the church burst open, and a dozen young men in black jeans and white t-shirts made their way down the aisle. Some were blowing whistles, and others were chanting rhythmically, "Church of hate, church of fear, stop crucifying queers." It was the human rights campaigner, Peter Tatchell, and some colleagues from Outrage, a group that had a public reputation for outing gay bishops. I remember thinking, church of hate, church of fear, stop crucifying queers? That doesn't actually rhyme. Anyway, they made their way to the front of the church, but there was only one set of steps up to the platform, and they were blocked by a junior bishop intent on martyrdom or perhaps hoping for promotion. So instead of going onto the platform, Peter Tatchell and his friends stood in a line across the front of the church, chanting. The atmosphere was pretty tense, to be honest. The Archbishop had left the podium looking flustered and was sitting with the dignitaries somewhere on the stage. A loud voice from somewhere near the front started to pray that God would remove the enemy from our midst. They were literally trying to pray away the gay. At that point, the Bishop of Chester stood up at the lectern. He had the considerable benefit of a microphone, and he said to the assembly, "Let's sing Shine, Jesus, Shine." So, whilst a dozen gay protesters in jeans and t-shirts shouted that they were being crucified, 1,000 vicars sang a cappella at the top of their voices that the light of God's love was shining, filling this land with the Father's glory. The protesters couldn't compete. Eventually, they made their way back up the aisle and out of the building, from the shadows into the radiance of the sunshine outside. There was no doubt that the senior evangelical Anglican leaders had won this round. I caught one young protester's eye as he walked out, and I recognised the look of brokenness mixed with defiance. I'd seen it in the eyes of many young people in my ex-pit village in the northeast. I can't remember what the Archbishop's talk was about or how well it was received. It didn't seem to matter much anymore. Blaze, Spirit, blaze, set our hearts on fire. When it was finished, we all filed out through the splintered back doors. Peter Tatchell and his few companions were standing immediately opposite the building on the other side of the road. They weren't chanting anymore. The police had penned them behind metal barriers. It meant that as we walked out of the building, each senior leader momentarily found themselves looking directly into the eyes of the protesters, no more than 20 feet in front of them. As we gaze on your kingly brightness, so our faces display your likeness. 1,000 evangelical leaders, and every last one of us had to make a choice. As you left the building, you could turn right towards Buckingham Palace, or you could turn left towards the bars and cafes of Westminster. Left or right, sheep or goats. Or you could walk straight ahead to where a dozen queer men were holding makeshift posters saying that you were crucifying them. By the blood I may enter your brightness. Search me, try me, consume all my darkness. Almost every one of us turned either to the left or to the right to disappear into the local cafes or head for the tube. Just 3 people didn't turn left or right, but walked straight across the road to meet the protesters. One was John Gladwin, then the Provost of Sheffield Cathedral. The second was Michael Vasey, a gloriously gay evangelical leader whose blue Homburg hat and red felt blazer stood out in a sea of black jackets and dog collars in the midst of the darkness shining. And then there was me, understanding for the first time the connection between my jolly university faith and the downtrodden young people of the pit village in Chester Street. I knew that if I didn't cross this road now, nothing about my Christian faith would ever make sense again. And that's the end of that story. Bless you, you're very, very kind. For those who have arrived a bit more recently, perhaps ought to say what on earth you've come to. My name's Andrew Graystone. I'm an alumnus of Emmanuel from many, many, many years ago, and a regular visitor back to see my brother and my mum and dad who live just down the road in Addington. And I'm reading a few stories tonight from my new book, which is called Faith, Hope and Mischief. And I can only read 3 or 4 or 5 stories tonight. If you'd like to hear any more, you can get hold of the book, Faith, Hope and Mischief, at all the usual places. Are you ready for another story? This takes me back to 2005. And this is a story that I call, It's Okay to Show Some Emulsion. The 2005 Conservative Party election campaign was the dirtiest of my lifetime. The Tories had been out of power for a decade and they were pretty desperate. They ran with the umbrella slogan, "Are you thinking what we're thinking?" Which, come to think of it, we might as well fix as the compulsory message for all parties at all elections. That way we could just have it printed up on posters and bring them out every 5 years. I was particularly aware of how dirty the campaign was because I'd accidentally found myself standing for Parliament as a Labour candidate for Hazel Grove. I say accidentally because I'd been selected by the unanimous vote of 8 members of the local party. That in itself was quite remarkable, as one of the 8 was standing against me. When it came to it, he didn't even have the confidence to vote for himself. But that's another story, also in the book. Jane and I had recently moved to South Manchester, to a colourful multicultural community where Bangladeshi, Pakistani, English and Irish cultures mix together in a glorious soup. Michael Howard's Conservatives ran a highly divisive campaign. As a result, we woke up to find that the billboard high up on the railway bridge beside our house had been plastered with a huge poster, a plain white background with black lettering 3 feet high, proclaimed, "It's not racist to impose limits on immigration." I was outraged. It may or may not be racist to impose limits on immigration, but to put that poster high on a bridge in a multicultural community was clearly a dog whistle intended to cast migrants as a problem to which a Conservative government was the solution. I imagined how that would feel to people from non-English cultures as they saw the message every day. Every time I walked under the bridge, it made my blood boil. Fed up with a boiling husband, the ever-practical Jane asked me what I planned to do about it. And so a plan was hatched. We realised there was only one word on the poster that we had a problem with, the word not. And it occurred to us that with a pot of white paint and a roller, we could correct it for them. And that's how, at 1 a.m, the parliamentary candidate for Hazel Grove and his wife were seen walking along a street in South Manchester with a ladder, a paint roller on the end of a broomstick, and a large bucket of emulsion left over from doing the kitchen ceiling. We had all the ingredients for a Laurel and Hardy tribute act. Now, for a middle-class boy from Croydon, it felt incredibly furtive to be carrying a ladder at dead of night. I was dreading a police car driving past and stopping us to ask what we were doing. I could see the headlines on the next day's papers. Election candidate caught, well, doing what exactly? Breaking and entering? Snooping into upstairs windows? No, officer, we were just taking the ladder out for some fresh air. When we got to the bridge, we realised that the job was going to be more difficult than we'd anticipated. First, the poster was considerably higher than the ladder. And second, the billboard was surrounded by an 8-foot-high metal fence with spikes on the top. Even to get close to the poster, we'd need to scale the fence and drop down to the other side, somehow bringing the ladder and the paint over with us. And third, the poster was floodlit. We were going to have to do all of this in full West End lighting. We propped the ladder against the fence, and I climbed up, shielding my eyes from the glaring lights. Carefully negotiating the spikes, I balanced on the top of the fence. I reckoned I could drop down onto the grass below without getting hurt. Jane could then pass the roller through the fence, but the paint would have to follow me over the top. Jumping off an 8-foot fence is one thing. Jumping off an 8-foot fence with a bucket of emulsion is going the full Chuckle Brothers. Then we realised that if Jane kept the paint bucket on her side, she would be able to load up the roller, then pass it through the fence. This might just work. While I balanced on top of the fence, Jane pushed the ladder up the outside, then pivoted it over the spikes and let it down the other side. Then I slid down the inside of the fence. Success! I was now inside a metal cage with the roller and the ladder. My wife was on the outside with a bucket of white paint. Momentarily, it occurred to me that if Jane wanted to get revenge for the last 25 years of marriage, this was probably the best opportunity she would get. I opened the ladder to its full length and propped it up against the hoarding. It was a ridiculously steep angle. I'm no good with heights. Jane loaded the paint roller and passed it through the fence. I climbed the ladder. Even at the very top, with my arm extended over my head and holding on to the very end of the roller, the paint would only just reach the word not. To get the paint to cover the word, I had to bounce on the ladder. I didn't dare look up, and anyway, the light was blinding me. So I just took a rough aim, looked at the ground, and by a sort of bobbing motion, aimed the roller at the word not. I could feel the watery paint running down the pole of the roller, over my hand and down my sleeve. Splashes of paint dripped onto the back of my head. I had a fresh appreciation of the way that Banksy suffers for his art. We reloaded the roller 2 or 3 times for good coverage. Each time I had to descend the ladder and climb up again. Then, more from exhaustion than completion, we decided to call it a night. I passed the roller back through the fence, climbed over and pulled the ladder back. Then we walked home again and fell into bed, feeling we'd made our stand against white nationalism. When I got up in the morning, I walked out to the scene of the crime. The cheap paint had run down the poster as if some enormous bird had dumped a watery load on it. The word "not" was still clearly visible, if a little greyer. It's not racist to impose limits on immigration. It's not sensible to climb a ladder with a pot of paint in the middle of the night either. But some things just have to be done. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'll tell you just one more story just now, unless we have time for a mini one at the end. I wondered after this story whether, I don't know whether this is even feasible, but whether anybody here after this wanted to ask anything or comment in any way. Maybe we could open up, it might be chaos, I don't know how this works, but maybe we could open up the muting after this, and if people wanted to, they could have a word. If you want to tell stories about your memories of the awful things my brother did to me when I was at Emmanuel, that will be fine. But let's listen to this, in which Croydon gets a good old mention. This is a story named after the main character. It's called Rocky's Story. In my late 20s, I lived in northeast England in an ex-pit village called Pelton Fell, just outside the market town of Chesterley Street, or Chesley Street, as it is correctly pronounced. We lived in a cute little semi-detached house, sandwiched between the general store and the chip shop. So the street outside our house was a natural gathering place for teenagers who had nothing to do. Between our front window and the road was a paved square about 15 feet wide, surrounded by a waist-high brick wall. It made an ideal wrestling ring. Night after night, groups of mean-looking kids would sit on the brick wall in front of our house and make up games that usually involved kicking the hell out of each other. They were aged between about 11 and 15, and to my Whitgift School mind, they looked like extras from a cast of Oliver. The house was so tiny that if I was sitting in the front room, they were almost within arm's length. This didn't used to happen in suburban Croydon, where I grew up. In Croydon, you could die in your front room and the smell wouldn't reach the road for a week. But in Pelton Fell, everybody quite literally knew who you were with, what you were watching on TV and what you were talking about. I could hear every word they said too, though as a South London boy deep in Geordie territory, I didn't understand one word in 10. I did catch that one of them was called Rocky, though I doubt that was the name that he'd been christened with. To leave my house, I had to walk through a crowd of young people hanging out in my own front yard. I would steel myself and walk purposefully out each day, weaving between Rocky and his mates, with a forced smile and a cheery greeting. They were rough, tough kids, and the honest truth is, I was afraid of them. I'd been hired by a local church to be a youth worker. I could not have been less prepared for the job. There was a gulf like the Grand Canyon between me and the kids sitting on the wall, and I had no idea how to cross it. But I took a principled decision that I should try to engage with these guys. I certainly wasn't going to start our relationship by trying to throw them out of my front yard. They needed to know that I was friendly. I would show them the love of Jesus in sign language if necessary. One evening, I was sitting in my front room writing a story at a typewriter. Already I realised that that is about the most middle-class sentence ever written. The net curtains meant that during the day I could see out, but I couldn't be seen. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't notice it getting dark outside, so that I could no longer see out of the window, but I and my brightly lit desk were perfectly visible to the outside world. Suddenly, my writing was interrupted by the plink of a stone hitting the window, followed by deep pubertal laughter. I jumped out of my skin. The boys had clearly seen me and were sending me a message. I went to the window and looked out, but I couldn't see anyone. I drew the curtains and went back to my work. Then a minute later, blink, another stone and another throaty laugh from the kids. Easy, Tiger, I thought. They're just kids. Don't overreact. You need to show them the love of God. Plink, plink. 2 more stones, and even louder laughter. Acting on pure instinct, I leapt out of my chair and ran to the front door. Red in the face, I threw it open and bawled at them at the top of my voice. What the fuck do you think you're doing? Get the hell out of my front yard! Leave me alone, you little... or I'll call the police on you! But I was shouting at their backs as they ran up the road laughing. They got exactly the response they'd been hoping for. I, on the other hand, turned back into the house, feeling like Judas Iscariot's less successful younger brother. In one 20-second burst of anger, I'd negated everything I'd gone to the northeast for. More particularly, I'd given away who I truly was, instead of the plaster face I'd wanted to show them. I was a complete failure. I was ready to hand in my youth work card and head back to Croydon to retrain as a taxi driver. I sat on the bottom of the stairs with my head in my hands. About 2 minutes later, there was a timid knock at the front door. I looked up to see that in my anger, I'd left it slightly open. A cold northeast fog was seeping into the house. I went over and opened the door a couple of inches further. It was Rocky. He was grinning. Got a light? He said. Rocky was about 12. I'll go and get one, I said. I'd never owned a cigarette lighter in my life, but I went into the kitchen and found the box of matches we used to light the cooker. I took them back to him. The whole gang of boys had now lined up behind Rocky, about half a dozen of them. Got a brew? Yes, I said. And without waiting, they pushed past me and made their way into the front room, which moments earlier had been my private protected space. 4 of them crammed themselves onto our new 2-seater sofa, and 2 of them perched on the back with their wet trainers dangling on the fabric. I would never have dared to do that. For the next 3 years, our house was rarely without a group of young people in it. Whenever a light was on, they were drawn to the house like moths to a flame. They hung out, taught me about their lives, ate crisps, and fought on the sofa. I learnt to love the smell of teenager mixed with cigarette smoke and honesty. They made me into a youth worker and showed me the love of Jesus. God knows what I showed them. And that's Rocky's story. Thank you.